and this is note 90, the ascent of Christianity is a movement of decadence. This ascent of Christianity is helped by primarily, he doesn't say this explicitly, but this regression of human, I'll use his term, of a quantum of humanness, right? This regression against a quantum of humanness, and hopefully this makes sense. It's technical, but if you've been following along, you should know what this means. So this regression of a quantum of humanness for Nietzsche is pretty much facilitated by the two scholars he has the least respect for, in my terms, right? In my terms, you know, Nietzsche has the least respect for Rousseau and Kant. He's like, Rousseau's general will is crap, and Kant's freaking moral obligations is ridiculous. I mean, he berates Kant. He berates Rousseau, right? And he looks at, Nietzsche looks at Rousseau and Kant as suffering from, and I think we'll see this later, I don't want to jump ahead, and I'm not going to say it now, but suffering from an infusion of Christian morality, right? There, Kant's metaphysics is infused by, or it's his critique against metaphysics, more properly probably his epistemology / ontology, is infused with Christian morality, and it infects his Kant's concepts. The same with Rousseau, right? The notion of the general will and egalitarianism and equality and shared voice and, you know, all the things that he talks about. Nietzsche describes it in terms of, he doesn't say this, but he describes both Kant and Rousseau in terms of sort of like these idealistic, sort of happy-go-lucky, completely naive, bewildered scholars. And for me, Kant's probably the most profound scholar I've ever read. The Copernican revolution is the deepest philosophical concept ever for me, right? Nietzsche's Will to Power a close second, a very close second. But it's important to see that Nietzsche has nothing but disdain for, and I think it's funny, right? Nietzsche has nothing but disdain. I'm sure you would conceivably respect them were they to, you know, have taught maybe, but he has nothing but disdain for what's known as Kant's moral fanaticism, right? Nietzsche says it directly in note 95. He calls Kant several times throughout the text before we get to the end of book 1. He calls Kant a moral fanatic, right? So he looks at Kant as moral. He looks at Kant as a moral fanatic. Nietzsche says, quote, "The movement back to Kant in our century is a movement back to the 18th century. Progress as regress." We're going back to Kant. You guys are still talking about Kant? Kant, he's a moral fanatic. Kant, this is not me, this is Nietzsche, right? This is me assuming, this is me channeling Nietzsche. Kant is a moral fanatic. Why would anyone want to listen to Kant? All he's giving you is obligation and moral imperatives. You have to subsume all of your values into this highest moral standard, which is ridiculous. I mean, no, don't go back to Kant. That's a movement backwards. We want to go forwards, not backwards, right? This is Nietzsche's gripe. This is Nietzsche's gripe. So the first is Kant as being informed by Christianity, and that Christian infection is weakening, according to Nietzsche, Kant's critique on metaphysics. It really would be interesting to see what alternative metaphysical account for you philosophical buffs out there. I'm not going to lecture on this, it's just popped in my head. But what, because I don't know, and I've read a lot of Nietzsche. Nietzsche primarily does sort of moral stuff, critique of morality. He doesn't, properly speaking, do metaphysics, and I don't know if Nietzsche is holding a bitter gripe because Kant, I think he is. He's a bit pissed off that Kant killed metaphysics, right? I think he's bad, but, you know, he killed God, but Kant killed metaphysics. Which of the two is a greater accomplishment? For me, the death of metaphysics is a far greater accomplishment than the death of God, which is not to knock Nietzsche, but killing metaphysics was the hardest thing in the world to do. Okay, has nothing to do with nothing. Sorry for the sidestep. What was helped? This Christian movement of decadence was, in a sense, legitimized by Kant, right? It was, in a sense, legitimized by Rousseau, right? So it was both the Rousseau, and there were other people he discussed throughout, but I'm not going to give you the notes verbatim. You know, I'm crafting these notes with a specific sort of discussion and presentation style. So for me, I want to focus on just Kant and Rousseau. So Rousseau, I'm reading 94. I'm going to read a section to you in 94. Okay, so this section, the first part. So he says, oh yeah, this is good. This is a good part. Right. Okay. All right. So in 94, the front. So in note 94, Nietzsche says with respect to Rousseau, later he's just beginning the assault. It goes on for pages and pages and pages and pages and notes. The French Revolution as the continuation of Christianity. Rousseau is the seducer. He again unfetters women. Now people recognize, right? It is very important to recognize my interpretation of Nietzsche. This might get me in trouble with the Nietzsche scholastic community, right? But it seems to me Nietzsche is pretty unabashed. He's a pretty unabashed, I wouldn't say sexist, but he thinks that the whole sort of women's lib, women's right, which is obviously fledgling at the time, it's a joke. He doesn't. I don't think he takes sort of the feminist movement seriously, right? He doesn't take sort of this women's right, and we'll address this a little bit later, seriously. This might skew your view of Nietzsche. The parts of him where he's ranting off sexist stuff, I would say overlook that. But there's still other. You can still use Nietzsche to incorporate a feminist understanding of the world, right? He might not have wanted you to do that, but you can, right? So he again unfetters women, who is henceforth represented in ever more interesting manner as suffering. Then the slaves of Mrs. Beecher Stowe. Then the poor. So it's like, I love the cadence, if you will. Then the poor and the workers. Then the vice addicted, and even the vice addicted and the sick. All of them move into the foreground. It's because of you, Rousseau. You're the seducer. It's all your fault, right? We've got women now unfettered. We've got slave narratives and people crying about the suffering. Abolitionists crying about the suffering of slave, and the poor and the workers, the vice addicted, everybody. All of these discourses are moved to the foreground, right? Even to develop sympathy for the genius, one no longer knows any other way for the past 500 years than to represent him as the bearer of great suffering, right? That's the key point, right? One no longer knows any other way. One no longer knows any other way for the past 500 years than to represent him, whoever this other is, as the bearer of great suffering, right? So that from Rousseau, what we end up getting is, there's a collective, this is collective suffering. The way we talk about things is with respect to suffering. This idea of decadence and the idea of pessimism and the idea of discouragement is all subsumed in our notion of great suffering, right? Right, the general will is to alleviate the and it sounds good, right? The general will is there to alleviate, and this is not it, this is sort of a perversion of it, but the general will is, and maybe I'll do Rousseau, maybe not. No disrespect for those people who like Rousseau, but the general will is it's a general will, right? It minimizes the highs and it elevates the lows, right? And it's precisely that act, right, of being general, right? Wherein those things that were high or that are high need to become meek, right? Pride is worse, meek is better. And those things which are low, right? Those things which are already low, right, are too low, need to be elevated, right? So the debasement, the suffering, the vice addicted, that's low state of affairs stuff. All of that now is being elevated. All the things that are already elevated are being devalued, and that's what you're selling us. And this is what, of course, I'm creating sort of a facetious type of characterization of, obviously, of Rousseau, but this is almost how it's presented in the text of like Nietzsche's like, dude, what are you doing? This is what he said, and he's like, this, you can't be serious. Like this is weak